Buenos días. ¿Recuerdan que ayer decíamos que si queremos entender las tendencias geopolíticas y el papel que en este contexto juega lo que hemos dado en llamar el sur global, teníamos que dar la voz también a esos países? Conocer cómo se interpreta y cómo se ve todo esto que está ocurriendo en el mundo desde esa otra parte. Y también reconocíamos que por no haber tenido en cuenta o por no haber prestado suficiente atención al punto de vista de esta otra parte del mundo, pues nos habíamos visto sorprendidos por una serie de acontecimientos. De alguna manera no habíamos utilizado los instrumentos intelectuales necesarios para comprender cómo iba a funcionar el mundo y cuál era la actitud correcta para abordar estas cuestiones. Por tanto, esta segunda jornada podemos considerarla una jornada esencial en el contexto de este curso de verano. Después de, hay que decir, una espléndida introducción ayer en la que pues, no solo tuvimos una mesa redonda muy interesante sobre temas del cine, poniendo el énfasis en la importancia que tiene el mundo de la cultura y de la comunicación, sino tuvimos una conferencia verdaderamente valiente por parte de Shlomo Ben-Ami, que se atrevió a abordar con absoluta sinceridad y con algún lenguaje a veces brutal la cuestión que nos aborda en la cuestión. Hoy empezamos la jornada con la embajadora de Sudáfrica en España, Sankey Mthembu Mahlanjele. Espero haber pronunciado correctamente su nombre.
Correcto.
La verdad es que ustedes tienen su currículum, pero leyendo su currículum podemos comprobar que su biografía y la trayectoria de su nación tienen una enorme coincidencia. Es una persona que se ha dedicado de forma muy activa y comprometida con la política, es también una intelectual que se ha dedicado al mundo de la literatura y en la actualidad ejerce también la diplomacia. Después de haberse formado en la Universidad del Norte en un momento tumultuoso de su país, se graduó en una licenciatura en 1976. Y a continuación se exilió al extranjero con el Congreso Nacional Africano, que entonces tenía su sede en Zambia, en su capital, Lusaka. Trabajó como periodista de Radio Freedom y trabajó con Thabo Mbeki en el Departamento de Asuntos Internacionales del Congreso Nacional Africano. Y durante este periodo escribió literatura bajo el seudónimo de Rebecca Matlu. Tras el fin del apartheid, fue nombrada viceministra de Bienestar Social y luego, más adelante, sería también ministra de Vivienda desde principios de 1995 hasta principios de 2003. En 2003 ganó un premio de Naciones Unidas por el hábitat, por su trabajo en la cartera precisamente de vivienda. Ven ustedes cómo forma parte de la historia del país en el periodo previo al apartheid, donde fue una persona activista por la lucha de los derechos de la nación y después ha participado activamente en su vida política. Tenemos pues un verdadero privilegio con su presencia para que nos pueda explicar cómo su país interpreta su política exterior y cómo entiende lo que está ocurriendo en la actualidad. Embajadora, tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And good morning to everybody. We are very happy to join you this morning to share with you this very interesting concept of the Global South. I'm honored and delighted to participate in this course organized by the National Center for Superior Studies in Defense, on geopolitical trends. Does the Global South exist? As part of the prestigious summer courses of the Madrid Complutense University. It's also a pleasure to be in the spectacular town of El Escorial, without doubt a town of marvelous architecture and natural beauty. I would like to start by sharing some thoughts on the general theme of this course, geopolitical trends. Does the Global South exist? The concept of the Global South, coined by Carl Oglesby in 1969, has recently enjoyed a remarkable revival as a descriptor of post-colonial and developing country solidarity in world affairs. As evidenced by the theme of this course, there are, however, those who express doubts about the term based on a literal interpretation of the phrase as denoting countries below the equator, with some critics noting, for an example, that India falls above that line, while some countries from the north are below the line, for an example, New Zealand and others. And others criticize the concept for attempting to capture an array of nations that differ markedly in their governing systems, in their economic circumstances, strategic alignments, and cultural identities. However, despite such critiques, the concept of the Global South is a reality and is beginning to resonate more and more.
Could you a bit closer to the...
Oh, I thought it was an echo.
Yes.
However, despite such critiques, the concept of the Global South is a reality and is beginning to resonate more and more in statements across the world. At the recent 2024 Munich Security Conference, President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana described an inherent instability to the global order produced by, I quote, a situation whereby the Global South, close quotes, where Africa features, is always at the wrong end of the stick in terms of its take-up of global assets. At the G77 and China summit in September last year, the Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel declared that, I quote, after all this time that the North, close quote, has organized the world according to its interests, it is now up to the Global South to change the rules of the game. And in September last year, in a speech before the UN General Assembly, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil observed that although, in quotes, the richest 10% of the world's population are responsible for almost half of all carbon released into the atmosphere, it is the vulnerable populations in the Global South who are most affected by the loss and damage caused by climate change. The numbers may differ, and the Global South may not have a leader and a secretariat, but it is a geopolitical fact. The term provides a unifying identity for many of the countries which share a history of colonialism, of imperial exploitation, and are now joined by a common desire to have a stronger say in the management of world affairs through a reform of the UN bodies and economic structure set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. This agenda has two main objectives on which I will elaborate further. First, the assertion of geopolitical non-alignment, and secondly, the demand for a structural overhaul of world power and economic relations. Over the past few years, we've also seen a revival of the goals laid down by the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement emerged from the Bandung Conference of 1955, a gathering of 29 countries representing half the world's population in Bandung, Indonesia, to facilitate anti-colonial cooperation. In his opening address, the Indonesian President Sukarno described a world in which I called colonialism is not yet dead, but had merely donned a modern dress. The message was clear. The era of formal empire was ending, but newly emancipated nations remained in subordinate positions. The Bandung generation championed non-alignment, knowing that attachment to either the Western or Soviet bloc would further expose them to foreign control or coercion. At recent global events, such as the Russia-Ukraine crisis, have begun to augur a return to the bipolarity of the Cold War. Many countries have become even more adamant that they do not want to be forced to choose sides. It is in this context that it can be said that countries belonging to a specific grouping, in quotes the Global South, are displaying a renewed willingness and ability to back the desires of the West. From Latin America to Africa, non-alignment has returned as a doctrine of foreign policy, preventing the West from building a global consensus around the war in Ukraine, among other things. The countries of the Global South, despite their unique positions, are united in a shared belief that their individual struggles are connected to the same core problem of global economic and political subordination. 60 years ago, Oglesby had stated that the countries belonging to the Global South are locked in a constant state of political and economic dependency. His dependency theory stood in contrast to the modernization theory that is so prevalent in the Global North, which posits that all societies move through similar stages of development, and that underdevelopment, post-colonial states could easily catch up to developed countries if they only pursued the right policies. According to Oglesby's dependency theory, undoing global poverty required substantially restructuring the global economy and reducing the power of core countries. In this regard, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of an independent Ghana, also maintained that decolonization had done nothing to alter the structural subordination of former colonies to former metropoles, much less to return stolen wealth and resources. He stated that newly independent states remained vulnerable to political and economic cohesion by wealthy states and former colonial powers. For African states to overcome this vulnerability, Nkrumah advocated Pan-Africanism, including the pooling of economic resources and political might. In 1964, inspired by dependency theory, the Group of 77, later known as the G77, sought to address the economic needs of developing countries, primarily by promoting manufacturing capacity within poorer nations, in the hope to produce finished goods domestically and thus reduce their dependence on wealthy countries. Today, the demands for changes in the political and economic power structures are stronger than ever. Many countries, which were often lectured by the West on human rights and on abiding by the rules-based order, are now in the forefront of trying to enforce international law. The countries of the Global South are turning to international bodies in an effort to hold the Global North accountable, as evidenced by the case that South Africa has brought to the International Court of Justice in connection with the Israel-Hamas war. The US and the EU's collective failure to uphold international law in Gaza has prompted accusations of double standards from the Global South, with many governments contrasting the US and Europe's soft stance on Israel with its unequivocal condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its limited support to Palestinians compared to its support for the people of Ukraine. Apart from that, evidence of rising racism in the North, the increased popularity of Europe's far-right parties, and the presence of populists in power in the EU and in the United States are making a mockery of Europe's and US's claims to be examples of values and equality. In this regard, we can also consider the growing importance of groups that have bypassed traditionally Western-centric multilateral institutions, such as the BRICS group, initially made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa until 2024, and which has now welcomed 4 new members: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. With its expanded membership, the grouping is positioning itself as a potential counterweight to the G7 and other Western forums. Countries representing the aspirations of the Global South are also having a larger influence in groups such as the G20. Changes in geopolitics, like the proverbial time and tide waits for no one, refusing to take them seriously, especially the core complaints of the Global South, risks binding leaders in the Global North to the inevitable changes in geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics. Time is of the essence. I'll now proceed to offer some insights into my country's foreign policy. One of the main principles which has guided South Africa's foreign policy since the dawn of our democracy in 1994 has been a strong belief in human rights and international solidarity. In 1994, the new democratic South African government inherited a country which had suffered international isolation because of apartheid. But we strongly believe that all that we had learned during our struggle and during my people's resistance against apartheid should become the basic building blocks of our future foreign policy. Today, the foreign policy of South Africa reflects the lessons learned during the struggle and the important role that international solidarity played in the process. Secondly, South Africa's foreign policy is based on a belief that its policy should reflect the interests of Africa. Our policy is rooted in the principles of a united, peaceful, and prosperous Africa. South Africa believes in the importance of the economic growth and development of Southern Africa and the rest of the continent, and the prevention of peaceful resolution of conflicts. Thirdly, South Africa's foreign policy is based on the need to advance global democracy. That is the rule of international law and multilateralism, and on the need to attain international peace. Fourthly, the search for a strong South-South cooperation is an essential part of South Africa's foreign policy. In the medium to long term, the world order that is emerging will be a product of how the global powers of the South will assert their newfound role and how this will balance with traditional powers. Fifthly, today our foreign policy continues to pursue strong partnerships with the countries of the North, such as those of the EU, including Spain. And the foreign policy of South Africa flows from its history. Our freedom was a product both of our people's struggle against apartheid, as well as international solidarity shown to us by other countries. Our support towards the Palestinian cause, as well as other issues, such as the dispute over the future of Western Sahara reflects the important role that international solidarity played in our own liberation. Our foreign policy also flows from the importance that the struggle gave the recognition of our common humanity. As the world experiences unprecedented levels of hatred among peoples, among races and religions around the world, there's no more expedient time than this to promote the African ethos of Ubuntu, epitomized by our leaders and especially by President Nelson Mandela. His view of human rights was based on his fundamental understanding of human interdependence and people's common humanity. President Mandela himself once said that Ubuntu is necessary to underpin an open international society where there's respect, there's sharing, there's caring, there's unselfishness, there's trust, as well as the ability to each one of us to enhance the well-being of those around us. Mandela's strong belief in the interconnectivity between the different groups within South Africa's highly diverse society led to a political system that ended up incorporating all of South Africa's different racial groups into the future, in quotes, Rainbow Nation, a concept coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The ethos of Ubuntu should continue to encourage us to pursue the value of reconciliation and tolerance in our foreign policy. This is important because over the past few years, the world has changed dramatically, with old challenges reappearing and new challenges fueling global tensions that affect all of us. Today, the foreign policy of South Africa reflects the practical necessity that the world is presently experiencing of making the philosophical paradigm shift from power to partnership in international relations. South Africa believes that in this increasingly uncertain environment, security, peace, and sustainable and sustained economic development and prosperity for all our citizens and our future generations depends on deepening people-to-people relations and mutual understanding between nations. Over the past 30 years, our international trade has also escalated, playing a key role in the eradication of the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which continues in my own country. The reason why is that the economic legacy of apartheid is still present in South Africa. It's visible as it is in the stubborn ownership patterns of wealth of our country that have yet to change. That's why one of the chief objectives of South Africa's international relations is also a commitment to the consolidation and support of our own democracy and our own socio-economic transformation. Our people, our history demand more of our diplomacy. Africa is the centerpiece of South Africa's foreign policy. Our destiny as a nation is linked intrinsically with the destiny of the continent of Africa. And our foreign policy actions are informed by the interests of our continent, beginning with our SADC neighborhood. Geographically, Africa is situated at the very intersection of many geopolitical dynamics. Apart from being endowed with oil and gas, another attractive feature in Africa is that the continent is rich in resources that are critical to the current priorities of the global economy, such as cobalt and coltan, minerals that are also important in emerging fourth industrial revolution. This situation is already reflected in the plethora of external powers that over the past decade have established or are in the process of establishing footholds in Africa, in their own national interest. Available opportunities and challenges have brought new actors to the continent of Africa: China, Turkey, and the Gulf states, and they've galvanized old ones, which are the US, Russia, and the EU. Yet South Africa believes that Africa cannot continue being a passive passenger in the changing global order. In June 1994, the newly elected President of the Republic of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, made a statement at the Organization of African Unity, which is today the AU, at the meeting of heads of state and government in Tunis, in which he recalled the decision by the Romans to destroy the city of Carthage in ancient times, and likened the destruction of Carthage to the eventual destruction of our continent, as its children were carted away as slaves. Its lands became the property of other nations, its resources a source of enrichment for other peoples, and its kings and queens were servants of foreign powers. South Africa believes that if Africa does not establish its own place in the new geopolitical and geo-economic landscape, external powers will step in to fill the void created by a lack of meaningful African cohesion. To strengthen Africa's position in the international scenario, South Africa has played an important role in political initiatives to strengthen our continental organizations, the African Union, but also the Southern African Development Community, which is SADC, as vehicles for the regeneration of Africa. South Africa's influence led to the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which is NEPAD, and especially the African Peer Review Mechanism, which have established an architecture created by Africans for Africa that is able to respond rapidly and timelessly to crisis, including unconstitutional changes of government. The African Peer Review Mechanism, as a product of NEPAD, makes what used to be impossible in Africa now possible. Countries can now review and advise each other on how best we can make democracy work for our people. Today we are resolute that Africa shall never again tolerate change of governments through undemocratic and unconstitutional means. Since its first democratic elections in 1994, South Africa has also played a major role in brokering peace and security in Africa. When it comes to conflict resolution and prevention, South Africans also believe in the need to apply African solutions to African problems. As a matter of the AU Peace and Security, as a member of the AU Peace and Security Council, South Africa has played an important role in the operationalization of the African peace and security architecture, which is a critical element in providing the AU with the necessary capacity to respond to our challenges of peace and security. The establishment of the African capacity for immediate response to crisis, championed by South Africa, is an interim mechanism to respond to emerging security situations, while the African Standby Force has also been operationalized. Today, South African leaders and our peacekeeping troops have participated in numerous missions aimed at contributing towards the peace and stability of the African continent, especially in the peace processes in Lesotho, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, South Sudan, and Cote d'Ivoire, among others. And South African peacekeeping troops are playing an important role in the conflict in Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. South Africa will also continue to support AU initiatives to find just and lasting solutions to outstanding issues of self-determination and decolonization on the African continent. South Africa subscribes to the principles of sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. We believe that the issue of Western Sahara remains an important challenge for the African Union, and for peace and stability in the Maghreb region, as seen by the ongoing tensions between Morocco and Algeria. South Africa believes that the combination of natural endowments, existent and planned infrastructure projects, geographic location, a youthful population, and other attributes provides Africa with a platform to diversify its economies and to integrate into global value chains. In this regard, South Africa believes that Africa is gradually leaving behind the colonial economic mindset, which has restricted African countries to the role of simply being exporters of primary products to countries in the developed North. In order to engage the world on a more equal footing, the imperative also exists for greater economic integration. Continental integration is essential for Africans to achieve greater strategic leverage and influence in global affairs, as well as to help to ensure that Africa's engagement with the world is based on the interests of Africans rather than of external powers. South Africa was particularly instrumental in the establishment of the Africa-wide Continental Free Trade Area, launched on 1st January 2021 under the leadership of a South African Secretary General, Wamkele Mene. This has been one of the most significant milestones in Africa's history, creating a single market with a GDP of over $3 trillion, which encompasses 54 countries, 54 of the continent's 55 countries, and includes 1.3 billion people. We believe that the continent is now finally starting to take charge of writing its own narrative. Over the past 2 decades, Africa's leaders have expressed and stated that self-reliance and the pursuit of African solutions to African problems, including the creation of regional value chains and the objective of making the continent self-sufficient, are essential ingredients if the continent wants to become an important player in the globalized world. As former President Mandela once said, we find ourselves at the dawn of the African century, a century in which Africa will occupy its rightful place among the nations of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, as one of the main tenets of its foreign policy, the South African government believes that an ideal world order should not be a return to the bipolarity of the Cold War, nor the unipolarity of the post-Cold War era. Instead, South Africa would like to see multiple centers of power emerge in a system that should offer more agency for less powerful developing Africa, continues to have a limited voice. South Africa believes that the developing world, and especially Africa, continues to have a limited voice and constrained participation in the decision and policy-making processes of the global political, trade, economic, and financial institutions. South Africa will therefore remain an active participant in the efforts to comprehensively reform the architecture of global governance, including the UN system and the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the UN Security Council, to align them to the changes in the global economic and political scenario. More than 60% of UN membership is now made up of countries from the global South and Africa constitutes about 30% of the whole of the UN membership. The UN Security Council has only once undergone a partial reform in 1963 to increase the number of non-permanent members to 10, leaving the permanent category intact. The anachronistic configuration of the Security Council is not sustainable in today's world, where 60 to 70% of its agenda is on African issues. The conflicts in Gaza and the Ukraine have evidenced once again that the UN peace and security architecture is clearly not able to give effect to solutions to ongoing human rights causes, such as the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, or to conflicts such as that of Ukraine. This has led some concerned states, such as South Africa, to turn to the judicial institutions of the UN, as we have done with the International Court of Justice genocide case against Israel. There's also a problem of the economic marginalization of developing countries through the imposition of unfavorable trade agreements and arrangements. It should be recalled that the influence of the G7 is not only of an economic nature, but also is embedded in a history of colonialism and the propagation of the cultural dominance of some states over the rest of the world. In this regard, South Africa is also a strong believer in the South-South cooperation. That's when we're talking of the South-South partnership. Joining the BRICS alliance was an important development in the recent history of South Africa's international relations. South Africa was invited to become a member of BRICS in December 2010. Our membership has produced tangible benefits by way of strengthened economic cooperation with our BRICS partners, tacit support to the African agenda, and calls for reform of global governance architecture. Today, with its new expansion, the voice and representation of BRICS includes 43% of the world's population, 32% of the world's land area on 4 continents, that's Africa, Asia, Europe, and South America, 27% of the global GDP, and 20% of the world's exports of goods and services. South Africa has insisted on several occasions that it does not see BRICS as an anti-Western bloc. BRICS is rather seen as a body of countries interested in meaningful relationships that can provide an alternative view of key issues. The expectation by countries of the South is that BRICS must use its influence and power to drive urgent reform of the international system, to make it fair and just for all. Meanwhile, IPSA, which is a forum with India and Brazil, celebrated 20 years of its existence in 2023, and our participation in the non-aligned movement and the G77 remain solid platforms for driving our South-South cooperation agenda. Finally, our foreign policy also focuses on building strong partnership with the countries of the North, such as those in the EU, including Spain. South Africa enjoys warm and cordial relations with all the members of the EU. These relations are executed through well-structured bilateral mechanisms. These bilateral engagements range from cooperation on the African agenda, economic diplomacy, the exchange of cutting-edge technology, capacity building, infrastructure programs, to human resource and social development, and multilateral cooperation. Among the European Union's 10 bilateral strategic partnerships with nations worldwide, South Africa is the sole African partner. As South Africa's foremost trading ally and the primary source of direct foreign investments, the EU also represents the most significant source of foreign direct investment into South Africa. EU-based companies invest in a wide range of economic activities in the country and have been a major contributor to South Africa's industrialization and transformation agenda. However, South Africa also believes that closer EU-African Union cooperation in other areas, especially concerning the political and security challenges on the African continent and energy security, is also required. However, My country believes that the recent winds of change sweeping over the European continent will impact relations with Africa as a whole. The EU was founded on a system of values, which include ideals such as solidarity, equality, and tolerance that emerged in response to the great suffering caused by the two world wars. For many years, the EU has been a major force in actively contributing to the promotion of democracy and multilateralism. The EU is, however, presently facing multifaceted challenges to its values. Right-wing parties have moved beyond the fringe throughout Europe, in countries such as France, Austria, Germany, Hungary, Poland, and the UK. In some countries, they actually govern. Coupled with this, there's been a substantial rise in the number of attacks relating to xenophobia and the politics of hate in all facets of life, including sports, revealing that the fundamental values of the EU are being eroded. Meanwhile, an excessive focus on the issue of migration in EU-African talks, a drop in support for multilateral solutions, and blatant attempts to strengthen trade protectionism are seen as threats to efforts to deepen relations between Europe and Africa. This year marks the 73rd anniversary of the opening of diplomatic relations between Spain and South Africa. However, the advent of democracy in South Africa dramatically increased the level of bilateral relations between the two countries. Today, South Africa acknowledges Spain's important position and its role in the international arena. The Spanish government also sees South Africa as an important strategic partner at a bilateral and at a multilateral political level, both in Africa and in the international arena. An important milestone in South Africa-Spanish relations was the decision by Spain in 2019 to identify South Africa as one of the 3 anchor countries for Spain's foreign policy in Africa, together with Nigeria and Ethiopia as part of the Third Africa Plan. 10 years ago, Spain also chose South Africa as one of its priority markets outside the EU. Since then, companies investing in South Africa benefit from Spain's PASE, which is Country with a Strategic Sector Action Plan, which allows companies which invest in these countries to access preferential financial resources. South Africa is aware that Spanish companies are leaders in the renewable energy and infrastructure sectors and has been encouraging exponential investment by these companies in South Africa. In the wake of this, in total, South African investment in Spain has grown exponentially. Of essential note is that nearly 27% of the contracts awarded under the first 6 rounds of South Africa's renewable energy program are already being delivered by Spanish companies. And this has provided a strategic platform to showcase Spanish technologies to Africa and the world. An important milestone in South Africa-Spanish political and economic relations was the visit of President Sanchez to South Africa on the 27th of October 2022, the first official visit of a Spanish head of state to the country. During his visit, Spain announced that it would allocate 2.11 billion to support the participation of Spanish companies in renewable energy and climate-related projects in South Africa in the coming 5 years, and several other important memos of understanding were signed during that visit. South Africa also recognizes and will pursue the vast opportunities that exist for cooperative partnerships between Spain and South Africa in a myriad of other fields, including academic exchange, sports, and science and technology. Allow me to end by briefly referring to the emergence of new issues that are growing in importance for the substance and direction of the foreign policy of my country and impacting the behavior of nations in international affairs, as well as the system and institutions of global governance. humanity is becoming more and more concerned about the threat of climate change and the damage being done to planet's Earth biodiversity. Meanwhile, globalization is intensifying, driven by technology, shrinking the world into one single geographic space. As time goes by, issues such as water, energy, and food security and sustainable development are starting to feature prominently in South Africa's foreign policy. In South Africa's policy plans, as we attempt to meet our present development needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The rise of non-traditional actors in diplomacy is also a growing feature of the 21st century landscape. Therefore, to strengthen South Africa's position in the new geopolitical scenario, my government has noted the need to increase its participation in multi-track diplomacy and in areas such as soft diplomacy. South Africa believes that it's important to enhance cooperation and participation in international exchanges between South African academic institutions, think tanks and civil society institutions, and the rest of the world, as well as people-to-people cooperation in all facets of human society, such as sports, culture, science, and technology. In conclusion, as changes sweep across the globe and touch the lives of people in even the most remote of habitants, South Africa has decided to not be a mere spectator. Over the past 30 years, we have broadened our international reach from 34 missions abroad in 1994 to a staggering 134 missions throughout the world today, but with a sharp focus on Africa. In this time of rapid and constant change, interdependence amongst nations and people is self-evident. It's also evident that mutually beneficial cooperation is a necessity. We believe that as countries work together, we will also be able to find creative solutions to all the challenges that face us in our increasingly interdependent global village. Allow me to end by once again expressing our appreciation and gratitude on behalf of the government of South Africa to the National Center for Superior Studies in Defense and the Madrid Complutense University for the recognition offered to my country, South Africa, by inviting us to participate in this course in the beautiful town of El Escorial. Muchas gracias.
Quiero decir que la densidad y la profundidad de ideas y conceptos que nos ha expresado en esta lección magistral, pues daría para un curso entero de verano. Pero, en fin, tenemos la ocasión de hacer algunas preguntas complementarias a este texto. Adelante.
Thank you, ma'am, for your conference. Very nice.
Bueno, voy a decir solo una cosa. Las preguntas, como tenemos que traducirlas, pido que sean breves y muy concretas, sin introducciones para evitar. Sí.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much indeed for your briefing, excellent briefing. One question. What do you think about the payment that Africa is paying for their own infrastructure development in terms of natural resources, for instance, to China, or about some military assistance regarding the African Legion, former Wagner PNC, because it was given some properties, mines, in the exploitation of mines to this PNC. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Entiendo que la pregunta es qué piensa la embajadora sobre el precio que África está pagando tanto a China como a Rusia, a China por las infraestructuras y a Rusia por la presencia de las tropas rusas, los grupo Wagner o Africa Corps.
Thank you for your question. That question is relevant to your course here, very central, because of the fact that you are probably searching for an understanding of what are the kind of things that are attracting the countries of the Global South. I think what we need to understand is the fact that, back to what we've said, after the two wars, the world believed that we are now moving into a situation where we want to leave the past. We want to move away from the violence, the aggression, and the hostility into a new world. And institutions were put into place. It was the UN Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions, and other multilateral institutions. Now, and of course, we also have the Cold War, where Africa felt that it's finding, let me say, countries of the Global South found themselves in the middle of the superpowers, being dragged this way and that way. And that didn't give us the opportunity to be able to be on our own because we are dragged this way and that way. And these are superpowers. But as time went and the relationships were developed, remember in our contribution we are saying we are continuing to interact, to trade, and to exchange whatever activities with the North, with the South, with the East, and the West. And in the process, there's been an experience. And the experience has been that, first and foremost, the Global South finds itself in a situation where it feels marginalized. Marginalized because, first and foremost, the way the economic structures or the way the economy of the world has been structured, it's marginalizing the Global South. We feel marginalized. We feel marginalized because the rules, the protocols, the mechanisms of how these economic structures work, they do not benefit us. Some countries have been independent for more than 60, 70 years, but we've got very little to show. Because what has happened is that everybody's coming in to pilfer, everybody's coming in to take. And Africa is now saying, we are at a stage where we feel strong enough and ready to manage our affairs. We had the OAU, we now have the African Union. It's the same structure, but in a different environment. But we finally also have now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is a tool which is going to assist us to be able to create, to manage, and deliver on our aspirations. We've worked with the West, we've worked with the East, and with everybody, but we are now saying we want to look at what we can do for ourselves in seriousness. When you see China coming in with its Road and Belt project, you see Russia coming in. They are coming in within our own terms. You might not want to believe it, but they are coming in within our own terms. Let me give you an example. there was a coup in one of the countries, and one country was asked to leave. Russia came in. It's hardly a year. That country is talking of beneficiation of its own resource. It has never happened in all of these years. For the first time, the country is saying, we've got a mineral resource, we are going to process it, we are going to finish it, we are going to trade it as a complete product. It's a rare activity. I'm just giving you an example. Secondly, when China and Russia come into Africa, they avoid interference with the affairs of the local. They avoid that. They come in for business, and they are looked as business investors. And at the same time, Africa is saying, we've got a young population, more than 60% is below the age of 35. Very energetic, very keen on technology, very creative, entrepreneurial. We want the investment to come to Africa. We want investors to come and work with us in Africa. And that's where this other critical discussion comes in, the issue of immigration. You'll have some of the youth in Africa leaving for Europe because they need to engage, they're seeking for greener pastures. But we're putting that issue on the table to say, this is a result of Africa finding itself not developing at the level at which it wants to be. And its youth wants to go out. But there is history to it. The history is the colonial powers that have come in, and when they left Africa with very little or nothing. This is the connection. And we're saying, let's look at this situation and see how we can mediate. See how we can get investment into Africa and keep the youth in Africa, share the skills with the youth in Africa, develop Africa, and then as partners, we trade and an exchange. So the people in Africa, when they look at China and Russia, they don't get scared. They look at them as partners. What can we do with you? What kind of trade and business can we do with you? This is what people outside the global south need to understand. You need to understand this dynamic. It's not because China or Russia comes in to say, don't work with the West, don't work with the EU. They don't do that. They come in and say, we want to invest in road, we want to invest in infrastructure. And this is the issue Joseph Borrell also mooted to. Olaf Scholz of Germany mooted to. President of France, Emmanuel, mooted to say it is going to be very important for Europe to adapt to the new emerging changes. The rise of an understanding of global politics, both politically, economically, and socially. The understanding is becoming different, and it's important that Europe adapts and begin to find an approach and a method that will make sure that it does not lose out. This is what needs to happen. The adaptation and the understanding of the needs and the interests and the aspirations of the global south, in particular Africa. We're saying we want to work with everybody. We don't want to be caged. We don't want to be compressed. We want to have the ability and the option to choose and to interact freely. And this is what everybody needs to adapt to. Because if you look at the development of our continent, we've had long relations with the West. We're beginning to have relations with the East. But the longest relationship our continent has had is with the West. So we need to look at that and say, what is it that needs to happen to maintain this partnership? And for it to be a partnership of equal partners, a partnership of respect and confidence for each other. And then we are going to have a situation that doesn't create an anxiety and a fear. It is not China and Russia that comes and says, don't work with the West. No, they just come in, they bring their resources, they put them on the ground, and we lay out our principles and our requirements. For an example, South Africa, we've got very specific labor rules. So when a Chinese company comes in, they've got to understand the kind of rules that apply there. So these are the kind of relationships that are developing. Sorry to take long, but I thought I needed to bring in the context of your question, why it arises. And we are being warned that the transactions that are taking place are going to leave Africa or the global south heavily indebted. We are quite aware of that issue, and our eyes are wide open on that issue of the kind of relationship and the kind of debt we enter. We're quite very much alive to that issue. And one will specifically say in South Africa, we look at the different options that are there. If a project comes in, it's a build, operate, and hand over. Or is it a build, operate, transfer, and hand over? We're looking at all of those terms because we're also learning and developing and understanding the workings of the industries of trade and exchange. So there need not be any fear. We're wide awake.
Tenemos una última pregunta.
De
nuevo, pido que sea muy breve la pregunta. Y claro.
Thank you, Ambassador. Your Excellency, your explanation about China and Russia interest has very, very clear, as well as the needs for Europe to adapt. As well, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. What is your opinion about the Global Gateway European Union's programs for aid development in Africa specifically, and how that works for South Africa?
Entiendo que la pregunta dice que ha quedado muy claro su explicación en la relación con Rusia y China, y ahora pregunta cuál es la relación de Sudáfrica con las políticas europeas de desarrollo. ¿Es así? The Global Gateway Políticas de Desarrollo.
Thank you for the question. We've made some positive steps in the relationship. We've got the EU-Africa partnership. And within that arrangement, there's been a lot of communication and a lot of sessions that set to look at the kind of programs that we think are quite urgent and important for the continent. And there's also been funding towards those projects. As far as one is concerned, it's a project that's going very well. And for an example, giving an example from South Africa, we've also been working on a very critical program in agriculture, where we're looking at the impact of climate change around certain kind of crops, and there's a scientific study that is taking place to try and modify our crops in such a way that they're sustainable. I know there's that kind of project, and it's going very well. And there are also a lot of exchange at an academic level between our universities and universities in Europe around issues of research. So it is going quite well. And we are also around this project also discussing an issue which is quite urgent and also very difficult to resolve because it's a natural issue, which is the issue of climate change. Things are moving very, very, very fast. And we have put on the table an issue that impacts on the economic impact of what's going to happen when we get into implementing some of the decisions and the protocols around climate change, having to reduce the level of emissions. You've got countries, for an example, that are like South Africa, whose economy depends partially on coal as energy. How do we move around, and at what pace do we begin to transit? And that's why we call it a just transition. And how do we do it? What do we do with those people whose livelihood depends on that industry? It's a bit of a difficult question, but it is an issue that is being discussed. And however, despite this big challenge, South Africa is second or third in the world in terms of the pace at which we are moving in relation to renewable energy, transition to renewable energy, the investment into renewable energy. So we've divided our energy needs into how we are going to phase out the coal, but how we are going to bring in renewable energy and other forms of energy, like we're beginning to discover gas on land and offshore. So those are the kind of issues that are on the table. However, we're also saying, and it comes back to the issue the gentleman raised there, to say we need to nurture these partnerships. We currently have on the table in the EU, it's an EU decision, the question of management and supervision of companies in the way they produce their products. We hear that by 2026, penalties is going to be meted out to those companies in Europe that are not reducing their levels of emission. And also, those who are importing into Europe, they are going to pay a penalty if at their point of production, their levels of emission are not at the standard required. Now, this is where the problem comes. It's very easy for the EU to accelerate and move and put up those standards and change company and the businesses and the companies in Europe also move at that kind of fast pace to be able to adhere to that. But in our situation down there, the pace might not be the same because you get rid of this factory and this production belt. What do you replace it with? You get rid and close down this company. What do you do with this myriad of people who must earn a living? So it's a very, very difficult issue. We need to talk as partners and see how we mitigate the impact on this issue. There's another issue. We need to nurture the partnerships. South Africa is exporting citrus fruit to the EU. And some countries in the EU say our product is not a good product because our oranges have got some little dark spots. Those dark spots are not a disease. Those dark spots do not have any negative impact on the fruit inside. We're beginning to feel that there's restriction in terms of the volumes of fruit that we can import to Europe. You know what happens? It means in those citrus farms in the Western Cape and the northern part of South Africa, we're going to retrench, increase the unemployment. Now, when you look at these two things, in the minds of people, people are looking at, but why is this happening? And that is why one is saying, please, let's look at the challenges and work in such a way that we meet each other halfway. Back to your question, the project is working very well. There's a lot of progress. There are these challenges. We can't just say there has to be, emissions must be reduced, and therefore this product comes from a steel factory in South Africa. We don't take it because their levels of emissions are high. What then happens to the relationship and the partnership? Let's work together. All we're saying is, let's work together. The world has become a very small space. It has shrunk because of communication, because of mobility and all of that. The problems of the world are everybody's problems. It shouldn't be like the problems of Africa are Africa's problems and the problem of Europe are not Europe's problems. We need to work together because we have a partnership. We've got an understanding that it's about humanity. So let's do that.
Bueno, yo creo que se nos ha hecho corto todo lo que hemos podido escuchar. Nos gustaría hacer más preguntas, pero creo que ha sido realmente una conferencia muy enriquecedora. La cantidad de ideas, de conceptos que han sido planteados es enorme. Yo querría incluso pedir a la embajadora si pudiéramos publicar su texto en nuestro Instituto Español de Estudios Estratégicos para tener ocasión de releerlo despacio. Creo que han sido muchos mensajes. Yo voy a quedarme con un par de ideas. Una es, Sudáfrica tiene una vocación que excede a su propio país. Ha hablado claramente de una vocación africana, de una necesidad de colocar a África en el lugar que le corresponde. Y además lo ha hecho apelando a una figura universal como es Nelson Mandela, que fue quizás uno de los hombres más importantes del siglo XX y que muchos hemos tenido el privilegio de conocer en persona y conocer ese liderazgo político y moral. Y nos ofrece el concepto de Ubuntu, que yo creo que es un concepto que nos sirve a todos, no solo a los africanos, de entender el mundo en términos de interdependencia. El mundo se ha globalizado y nunca podremos desglobalizarlo. Podremos establecer barreras al comercio, a la tecnología, pero el mundo ha quedado globalizado y de modo que no hay más remedio que el mundo coopere y sobre todo dos conceptos muy importantes, ¿no?, que es la reconciliación y la tolerancia, porque no cabe duda, como ha dicho también la embajadora, el odio está cada vez más presente y no podemos permitir que sea el odio quien rija nuestro futuro, ¿no? Y algo que es esencial en esta nueva relación que tenemos que establecer con África, los occidentales, porque ha dicho claramente la embajadora, no tiene Sudáfrica ningún problema con Occidente. Lo que quiere Sudáfrica, lo que reclama es un trato en el mismo plano, un trato que no tenga un componente de subordinación, sino de diálogo entre iguales. Yo creo que todas estas ideas nos enriquecen. La reflexión de esta mañana ha sido muy constructiva. Nos ha explicado cómo se interpreta lo que está ocurriendo desde el sur global. Los argumentos han sido irrefutables y, por tanto, pues yo pido un aplauso y un agradecimiento a la embajadora.